Bulletin edition of the Countdown podcast. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito has not only now confirmed that the upside-down American flag flown in front of his home 3 days before President Biden's inauguration was meant to support the Trump Stop the Steal plot, but in blaming his wife and his neighbors for it, Alito has also blatantly and transparently lied in his excuse. Quote, I spoke directly with Justice Alito about the flag story in the New York Times, posts Shannon Bream, a host on Fox News. In addition to what's in the story, he told me a neighbor on their street had a, quote, F Trump sign that was within 50 feet of where children await the school bus in January 21. That's the lie. Local schools, City of Alexandria, Virginia, and Fairfax County, Virginia, had resumed remote learning a month earlier. There were no school buses in January 2021. There were no kids waiting at bus stops, waiting for the school buses that never were there. Alito seems to have forgotten that anybody could check this. Continuing from Shannon Bream, Alito confronted the neighbor who had the sign so offensive to school kids who weren't there waiting for buses that weren't coming. Quote, according to Justice Alito, things escalated and the neighbor put up a sign personally addressing Mrs. Alito and blaming her for the January 6th attacks. Justice Alito says he and his wife were walking in the neighborhood and there were words between Mrs. Alito and a male at the home with the sign, unquote. Again, this sign could not have been seen by any kids at any bus stop. Quote, Alito says the man engaged in vulgar language, quote, including the C word, unquote. Following that exchange, Mrs. Alito was distraught and hung the flag upside down, quote, for a short time, unquote. Justice Alito says some neighbors on his street are very political and acknowledges it was a very heated time in January 2021, end quote, Shannon Bream. Except that last contention from Alito seems also to be a lie, or at best, some classic paranoia. CNN reporter Holmes Librand went gumshoe, quoting him, I spoke with some of Justice Alito's neighbors who said they remember the American flag being flown upside down at his home, but did not recall any neighborhood drama surrounding it. Each neighbor I spoke with reiterated multiple times how kind and well-liked the Alitos are. Unquote. Granting that Alito has a hair trigger for any criticism about anything and has constructed for himself a world in which his religion is under assault in this country, and that Mrs. Martha Ann Alito has a widespread reputation for exaggerated personal behavior, and that they could have interpreted the tone behind the word hello as an indicator of a neighbor being, quote, very political, the state of political discourse in Alexandria, Virginia, obscures a larger issue about Alito and how politically corrupt he had become by this point and what this flag represented. Glenn Thrush of the New York Times hit that nail on the head. To quote him, this appears to be a confirmation that, one, the Jody Cantor story in the New York Times is accurate. Two, he had a general awareness that an upside-down flag was an emblem of Trump's rejection of a free and fair election, unquote. Thrush does not note it, but Alito's comments to Fox also contradict his response when the New York Times broke the original story. Quoting him, I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag, Justice Alito said in an emailed statement to the Times. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs. Alito had no involvement whatsoever, he says there, in the flying of the flag when contacted by the Times on Wednesday or Thursday. But by Friday, he suddenly had an involved and intricate story of an increasingly bitter and intense series of confrontations with his neighbors, including his wife becoming, quote, distraught, including exact language used, including himself, and especially this vivid and enraging detail about the flag with the F word being visible to neighborhood children at the school bus stop that had not been used in at least a month. there were not any children at that bus stop for at least a month. As congressional aide Aaron Fritchner was the first to note, citing Washington Post headlines from that time, there were no school buses in much of December 2020 and all of January 2021 in that neighborhood. On November 23, 2020, Alexandria, Virginia City Schools announced they would be going back to remote learning because of COVID surges. On December 14, 2020, Fairfax and other county schools, the only others that would have had school buses in the area near the Alito's Alexandria home, the counties announced they would also close the school buildings. Fairfax classrooms did not reopen until February 15, 2021, Alexandria's a few days earlier. Alito's truthfulness in claiming his American flag was flown upside down for a short time is also in serious doubt. A photograph showing it is time-stamped January 17th. The Times has posted it at its website. As the Times noted, in an email from January 18th, 2021, reviewed by the Times, a neighbor wrote to a relative that the flag had been upside down for several days at that point. When did it get that way? January 16th, 15th, 14th? Should we go all the way back to January 6th? Also lost in Alito's apparent dissembling about the granular details of his Stop the Steal protest is the idea that whoever hung that flag upside down, or how many ever days or weeks it hung that way, how on earth a man who has now been on the Supreme Court for 18 years could have possibly thought that any form of in-public political protest hanging outside his own home was acceptable conduct for a Supreme Court justice, that remains unanswered. Alito now tells Fox News this entire backstory of how the flag got there, and not once does he address when it finally dawned on him that it was utterly inappropriate and that it damaged the neutrality and legitimacy not just of his own tenure on the court, but of the Supreme Court itself and of the entirety of the American judicial system. Alito was also on the U.S. Court of Appeals for 16 years. He probably can still remember that because ethical guidelines actually applied to justices on that court, had he or his wife or just some neighborhood prankster or perhaps a ghost hung a political protest flag outside his house in the time between an attempted coup and the inauguration of the legitimate president, not only would he have come under formal review for that, but all of his court's decisions, even remotely connected to politics or protests or candidates, would have come under formal review and possibly have been overturned. Clearly, at some point, Justice Alito must have determined, hey, this is a mistake. Why didn't he do it earlier? There is also a real reason to investigate this particular one of the many disqualifying incidents involving Sam Alito. The exact date when his American flag at his home was turned upside down to represent the Stop the Steal movement, turned upside down by him or his wife or the goddamned wind. The exact date is vital information. Several years ago, the then Trump Kraken lawyer turned plea deal taker Sidney Powell revealed that the backup plan, if Mike Pence did not illegally overturn the election and the mob did not stop the certification on January 6th, was to get a Supreme Court justice to stop the certification for them. Guess which one?
We were filing a 12th Amendment constitutional challenge to the process that the Congress was about to use under the Electoral Act provisions that simply don't jive with the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And Justice Alito was our circuit justice for that. Louis Gohmert was the plaintiff in our lawsuit. And we were suing the vice president to follow the 12th Amendment as opposed to the Electoral Count Act, or Electoral College Act. So that was the main point. And Nancy Pelosi had finagled to file an amicus brief in it. There'd been inside goings on in Congress whereby I believe it was Steve Scalise and McCarthy kept her from being an actual party. wanted to work her way into the case as a party, but somehow politically that didn't happen. But so she got noticed when we made her filing because she wanted to file an amicus brief, or had filed an amicus brief. And then, everything broke loose, and she had to really speed up reconvening Congress to get the vote going before Justice Alito might have issued an injunction to stop it all, which is what should have happened.
In short, while Mrs. Alito was flying her freak flag, or preparing to, and Congress was literally under attack, Trump lawyers expected that at minimum the certification would be postponed until January 7th by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. But before it could happen then, Sam Alito would issue a stay preventing the peaceful transfer of power to President-elect Joe Biden, while a Stop the Steal flag was hanging from, or was soon to be hanging from, his home. That is the core of this extraordinarily important story that got less attention from the media than did the high school graduation of Trump's son, whose name he barely remembers. And by the way, Sidney Powell, the word is jibe, J-I-B-E. Jive, what you said, is what your logical rationalizations of treason are. Lastly, pathetically and predictably, the Democratic response to Alito and Stop the Steal has been terrified and mouse-like. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Dick Durbin says that this is proof that Congress needs to pass ethics reform for the Supreme Court. Nothing about forcing Alito off the court, or hearings, or sanctions, or getting the Department of Justice involved. Just a milquetoast request that Alito recuse himself from upcoming Trump-related decisions about January 6th cases, and this farcical, fabricated presidential immunity that could overturn the democracy itself. The Democrats should be calling for Alito's immediate resignation, or a boycott of the Supreme Court, or at least hearings into this. Instead, they are hoping that John Roberts does something. John Roberts would not be willing to take Martha Ann Alito's flag away from her. What would the Republicans be doing if, to merge two current Supreme Court scandals involving them and their wives, if, say, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had hung an Antifa-related flag or sign from her home for several days and taken cash and gifts directly from George Soros? Chairman Durbin needs to think about the answer to that question, or somebody needs to think about it for him, and then he should do that thing. The rest of this edition of Countdown is a repeat of Friday's regular edition, including James Thurber's short story, How to Relax While Broadcasting, and, next, a translation of the amazingly self-unaware mission statement issued by the amazingly self-unaware Chris Cillizza. If you have heard this previously, and you hit stop now, I will not take offense. Postscripts to the news. Some headlines, some updates, some snark, some predictions. Dateline Washington, D of C. This just in, Chris Cillizza has issued a mission statement. No. Mission, not e-mission. I don't know how many times I've talked about Chris Cillizza, who used to be, when he worked for the Washington Post, a semi-regular on Countdown on MSNBC. And then he developed an unfortunate habit of both-sidesing everything except stuff that didn't really matter. No one reporter is responsible for but her emails. The obsession with the story, which we think of as 2016, but actually started in 2015 and went on for more than a year, that moment of obsession, which may yet be the official start of the day that American democracy caught its fatal illness, that doesn't owe to one guy being a bad reporter, or just not understanding what it was he was supposed to do, or how he was supposed to evaluate truth from falsehood. Simply because both of those things was said by people wearing ties didn't mean you had to give equal balance to them. It owes, in a larger sense, to a combination of decreasing training and decreasing intelligence among reporters, because I don't know how many more good reporters there are now than there were in 1970, but the number of outlets that can give them prominence is about 10 times as large. For all of the contractions in the news industry, and there have been so many great news organizations that have gone right out the window and under the bus and into the toilet and all the other cliches you want to use, for every one that's gone out of business, there's been 100 new ones, and they've all been crap. But they do give jobs, or at least platforms, to people, and one of them was Chris Cillizza. And in addition to sort of overall stupidity in the news media that's gradually taken over in the last 50 years, the second part is FOMO, fear of missing out on somebody else's story. If you look at someone else's newspaper, newscasts, podcast, Twitter feed, and there's something on there that you have not emphasized and they have, and they're all excited about it, your instant reaction is to get excited about it too. I look at it and go, this is not interesting, sorry. That's unfortunately not what most of them do. And when they write the history, if after but her emails there is any history and anybody is allowed to write it, the book that comes out about but her emails may very well have Chris Cillizza's picture on it. Just in the middle 6 months of the year 2015, just in those 6 months, he wrote 50 different pieces and blog entries and articles for the Washington Post on her emails, Hillary Clinton's emails. And the headlines, and again, he may or may not have composed these, blog posts are different than newspaper articles. You can always depend on the idea that a newspaper article headline was not written by the person who wrote the article, but that's not necessarily true on a blog post. Every blog post I ever wrote, I wrote my own headlines. And these were just some of the headlines in that segment that he did for the Washington Post called The Fix, between March and I guess September of 2015. You ready? March 3rd, The Fix. Hillary Clinton's private email address at State reinforces everything people don't like about her. March 4th, the Hillary Clinton email story just keeps getting worse for her. August 12th, this email story just keeps getting worse for Hillary Clinton. And you'll notice that's the same thing he said the previous time, only with the words in different order. Then, let's see, this is August 9th. Hillary Clinton's email problem isn't going away. August 11th. Hillary Clinton email issue is not going away anytime soon. September 14th. Hillary Clinton's email issues have become a massive political problem. July 30th. Hillary Clinton as honest and trustworthy as Donald Trump. April 28th. Hillary Clinton has answered 7 questions as a candidate. Here are 7 more she should answer. But of course, I'm only scratching the surface here because it's a podcast and the amount of time I have available to me is infinity. It's kind of majestic when you read the headlines together like that, when you look at the big picture. It's like that scene in the movie The Right Stuff about the founding of the American space program, where they set up and lift off trial rocket after trial rocket, and they all collapse. Some of them get like 3 feet off the pad and then implode upon themselves, and they show the reflections of everything going up in flames and the eyeglasses of the scientists behind it. And Werner von Braun looks very unhappy. And machine after machine blows up in the air on the launch pad while they're carrying it out, while they're drawing it. The drawing blows up. It's like that. Looking at those emails, especially ones like the Hillary Clinton email story just keeps getting worse for her, followed by this email story just keeps getting worse for Hillary Clinton, followed by Hillary Clinton's email problem isn't going away. Anyway, the man who was behind all that, Chris Cillizza, who eventually left the Washington Post to go to work for CNN, only to get fired there, and has been independent ever since, has now issued a mission statement. And this is the crux of what I want to talk about here. He wrote this apparently about a week ago. I only saw it yesterday, so it's news to me because this Chris Cillizza mission statement story isn't going away. I watched Jerry Maguire over the weekend. That's another movie, and I know I make too many movie references, but at least the ones that I refer to don't suck. I refer to the right stuff. He's watching Jerry Maguire over the weekend with my wife and kids. It's a little cheesier than I remember. Okay, a lot cheesier. Something that's often said about Chris's work. But one thing stuck with me, Jerry's mission statement. A vision of what he wanted to do and why, how he could be different and better. So I wrote my own on journalism. Now, before you say this must be fiction, let me read it to you. Bullet point. I will hold politicians to account when they lie, when they obfuscate, or when they try to play too cute with their words or their actions. I will be tough but fair on Donald Trump. I will be tough but fair on Joe Biden. I will not conclude that something is good solely because Democrats do it, or something is bad solely because Republicans do it, or vice versa. I will never write things for clicks or to add subscribers who want red meat thrown at them. I will always show my work and how I got to my conclusions. I will admit when I got it wrong and explain how and why it happened. I will never talk down to you or assume I know better. I will always work to foster kindness and civility in our community. No. None of this is meant ironically. Anyway, that's the short version. Well, I've gotten a hold of the long version. It has all that, and then it goes on to say, I will not hold politicians to account when they lie. I will not be tough or fair with Donald Trump. I will not be tough or fair with Joe Biden. I will conclude that something is good solely because Democrats do it. I will always write things for clicks. I will never admit when I got it wrong. I will always talk down to you and assume I know better. You see what I did there? He's both sidesist. So the first half of his mission statement would consist of all those noble statements, but my satirical second half, in that he would contradict all those noble statements. See what I did there? This caused me to text a couple of my old MSNBC colleagues with a variation of this basic message. Remind me why we used to book this guy on the show. Did he drive himself into the office? Did he bring the crew food? Instead, I was reminded that the stuff from, I remember in 2006, 7, 8, as I said here once, when we used to have real trouble getting guests on MSNBC, Chris Cillizza was always ready to go. Probably brought food to the crew. It wasn't just then, or with the email stuff. It's keeping in pace to this day. I was reminded by somebody that during the Super Bowl, remember the RFK Jr. ad? Where they stole his uncle's 1960 presidential campaign ad word for word and had him voice it. Only, of course, it sounds like a frog that's been kidnapped and being held for ransom. They spent $15 million on it, but of course he had nothing to do with it. It was done by an outside group. There was no coordination. He put it at the head of his Twitter feed. He pinned it. So the FCC got involved, or FEC got involved. And the family, the Kennedys, denounced him. Right after it aired during the Super Bowl, somebody had tweeted, the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ad was brilliant, and Chris Cillizza saw that about this commercial that the world would condemn within minutes, and he got there first and retweeted it and added, quote, totally agree. Hillary Clinton as honest and trustworthy as Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton has answered 7 questions as a candidate. Here are 7 more she should answer. There is nothing out there that Chris Cillizza cannot get wrong or get right and then correct himself so he remains wrong, or get wrong and right, or get right and then correct it and then correct the correction so he winds up being wrong 75% of the time. He insisted that the models said Trump had not even the slightest chance of re-election. He wrote this at the end of September 2020. The models must have been Zoolander and Gisele Bündchen. He predicted a Republican red wave weeks before the 2022 midterms. He said that when she would not put Jim Jordan and Jim Banks on it, Nancy Pelosi, let me get the exact quote, doomed the already tiny chances of the January 6th committee actually mattering. And then the first time we mentioned him here in this podcast, November of 2022, the House Majority Whip, Jim Clyburn, South Carolina, history degree from South Carolina State, history teacher in high school, said on Fox, the facts are very clear. I've studied history all of my life. I've taught history, and I'm telling you what I see here are parallels to what the history was in this world back in the 1930s in Germany and in Italy. And Chris Cillizza knew better than Jim Clyburn, because Chris Cillizza is a very serious political reporter. I mean, look at all the extensive coverage he did of the Hillary Clinton email story and how decisive that was in the election. That proves he was right? Also, he hosts Political Trivia Night, and he went to Georgetown. Chris Cillizza wrote after Jim Clyburn said, hey, this looks like Nazi Germany like in 1932, so pre-Nazi Germany or Italy before Mussolini started wearing the uniform and killing people. Chris Cillizza wrote less than a year and a half ago, I guess about a year and a half ago, rule number one of politics goes like this: don't compare anything to Nazi Germany, just don't. Before we go any further, it's worth noting here that comparing anything to the Nazi regime, which led to the systemic murder of more than 6 million Jews, is a mistake. It just is. There is nothing in our current moment that suggests we are anywhere close to that. Well, of course, the whole point of what Clyburn was saying was he was not comparing Hitler to the current moment of November 2022. He was comparing it to our immediate future. He was comparing the Hitler of 1930 to our America of 2022 and thus of 2024. What is ahead for us? What I see here are parallels to what the history was in this world back in the 1930s in Germany, in Italy. He didn't mention the Nazis. Chris Cillizza did. Then at about the same time, there was this tweet that went out. America needs a total cleansing only Trump can do with the help of true patriots. Herschel Walker sent that. It was in response to the nutjob lawyer Lynn Wood, who had tweeted calling for the execution of Mike Pence by a firing squad in November 2022. The response from Chris Cillizza to that was the election deniers like Herschel Total Cleansing of America Walker, quote, represent a serious threat to our way of life. After all, if we can't accept that our leaders were fairly elected and have faith in the system, it's very hard to imagine how we can expect anyone to effectively govern. That's what would be wrong with a fascist coup to overturn a democratic election and install a loser as winner and do heaven knows what to the actual elected president. That's the problem there. It would interfere with governance. The lines at the Department of Motor Vehicles would quadruple if there were a civil war going on or a coup, or if there were tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue and Chris Cillizza was at the DMZ. Imagine the inconvenience for Americans trying to report for jury duty. Now, I'm not going to say Cillizza ignored the idea that there might be a fascist coup. He did address this. Another fascist coup? Which is bad! Exclamation point. Very bad! See, you know it's more important because he used it very on the second reference. But it's also worth remembering that democracy held in 2020, even while it was under active assault from Donald Trump and his minions. Again, the man who helped bring you but her emails is saying, what do you mean, attempted murder? He's not dead, is he? Quote, we absolutely should be vigilant about the potential rise of authoritarian politicians who would wipe out things like the rule of law to further their own political ambitions. But let's stop making the Nazi Germany comparisons for all of our sakes. Politicians who would wipe out things like the rule of law, because there's lots of other things they could do that would have as much damage as wiping out the rule of law. Again, tanks blocking Chris's way into the DMV. That would really be a tragedy. I mean, what would happen? What would happen if he was going back to the world's only remaining blockbuster with that copy of Jerry Maguire that he'd watched with his wife and kids and found it a little bit cornier? What if he was trying to return it and they were cooing out there in the street and he couldn't return the VHS? I mean, it's probably the only VHS copy. What if it got damaged? What if they shot up his car and, nobody was hurt, but the VHS copy, the videotape of Jerry Maguire, were the last living copy of Jerry Maguire? I mean, isn't anybody going to think of Tom Cruise? Won't somebody think about Tom Cruise's work gone forever because of this coup? I mean, this is what we have to worry about. Politicians who would wipe out things like the last copy of Jerry Maguire. But let's stop making the Nazi Germany comparison for all of our sakes, even though Trump keeps quoting Hitler, even though Trump kept a copy of Hitler's speeches by his bed. The next day after Cillizza wrote that, Elon Musk told his 115 million followers to vote Republican and then responded to a quote that was falsely attributed to Voltaire that was actually spoken by an American neo-Nazi pedophile. And the day after that, Musk tweeted a photo of a Nazi soldier from 1940. Chris Cillizza. Mission statement. Hillary Clinton finally apologizes for her private email server. What took so long? September 8th, 2015. Hillary Clinton's apology interview annotated. September 9th, 2015. Hillary Clinton's worst week in Washington. August 21st, 2015. Now, you know what? The whole 52, 56, 60-week stretch from about that headline through November of 2016, those are all tied for Hillary Clinton's worst week in Washington. And in fact, those are all tied for, to that point, America's worst week in Washington. And people like Chris Cillizza are responsible for it, and never in their lives will they ever understand this. If you could actually claim that your mission statement should include, I will never write things for clicks or to add subscribers who want red meat thrown at them. I will always show my work and how I got to my conclusions. I will admit when I got it wrong and explain how and why it happened. Chris Cillizza, literally 9 years after he was as wrong as anybody in American journalism could be wrong, doesn't even know that this is where he was wrong and will not admit that he got it wrong and cannot explain how and why it happened because he doesn't believe he got it wrong. I will never talk down to you or assume I know better, except for these 50 articles about Hillary Clinton's emails in just that 6-month period. That's not even the whole list. So, reading all this, I was thinking about asking Chris Cillizza for a comment to put in this podcast about how these stories, Hillary Clinton finally apologizes for her private email server. What took so long? And the upcoming looking back at the 10-year anniversary of Hillary Clinton's email servers. My best 57 articles on Hillary Clinton emails. I thought, I could ask him about that. I was thinking of sending him an email. What do you think? To the number one story on the countdown, and it's Friday and the weekend edition, so that means a little more James Thurber for you. James Thurber had many full-time jobs. He was a street reporter for the Columbus Dispatch and later the New York Post, and he was an editor of the New Yorker long before he was a writer or cartoonist there. And people kept trying to make him into a radio star, leading to a short story which is, understandably, one of my favorites. A lot of it speaks of broadcasting in another world and, of course, another century. But it is amazing how much of what you will hear now is still true today. From the May 5th, 1934 edition of the New Yorker, How to Relax While Broadcasting by James Thurber. The evening I went up to the studios for my first radio broadcast. I got off by mistake at the 16th floor instead of the 17th. I decided not to wait for the elevator, but just run up the stairs to the 17th floor because elevators in broadcasting buildings are always crowded with small Italian musicians carrying cellos. And furthermore, when the up sign above the elevators in these buildings lights, the operator of the car that stops for you usually says, "Down!" And before you can think, you find yourself on the first floor again without any way of getting back up because you surrendered your pass to the man at the desk in the lobby the first time you went up. I walked to a door on the 16th floor marked stairs and stepped out into a cold, dark staircase shaft and walked up one flight. I found that the door on that floor wouldn't open. It was after 7 o'clock in the evening and the door had been officially locked. I hurried back down to the 16th floor and discovered that the door there had locked behind me, too. I began to beat on it and kick it. From far off, a faint voice came to me finally saying, "Cut that out!" The only thing to do was walk down 15 flights to the main floor, which I did, but the door out into the lobby was also locked, and nobody answered my screams and poundings. Screaming and pounding is not radio, as the broadcasting people say. I went down into the basement, which was dark and gloomy, and hunted for the elevator shaft. I found it, but there was no bell to push, so I sat on an old chair until the car came down. The operator was surprised to see me and asked me for my pass. I told him I didn't have a pass. He thought a while and then asked if Mr. Heyman knew I was down there. I said I didn't think so. He was pretty much alarmed by that, but he took me up to the 17th floor after warning me never to come down to the basement again without a pass. There was nobody on the 17th floor who understood my case, although the people I talked to were patient and courteous. They said the 17th floor was entirely given over to the business department and had no studios or microphones. What I probably wanted was the 27th floor. Up there, I found some people I had met before, but they were pretty busy and seemed to think it was the wrong night. I sat down in a chair, and presently a man came up to me and asked me if I was Mr. Totherer. I said I wasn't sure, and he said to follow him. I was shown into an office where there were some officials I knew and some friends of mine. One of the officials was denying a story somebody had been telling about a man who fell dead in front of the microphone. It seems he had merely had a stroke. In a little while, I was led in a solemn march to a small and lonely studio, heavily draped and silent. I took out a cigarette but saw a sign saying no smoking, so I put the cigarette away again. Some men in the glassed-in control room began to look at me. I could see their lips move, but I couldn't hear anything. A man tiptoed into the room where I was and shook hands with me and tiptoed out again. He never came back. I walked over to a regular microphone, such as I had talked over once or twice before and had got used to, but somebody led me away from that, said I was to talk over a table microphone because it would help me to relax. This turned out to be a table about the size of a card table with a microphone set innocently in its center, face up, more or less like an ashtray. Its studied simplicity caused me to tighten up slightly, and I mentioned this to a man. "Be at your ease," he said. I stood over the table, grasped its edges firmly, and leaned down toward the microphone. Someone grasped me. No, he said. You just sit down at the table as if you were sitting in a chair at any table and talk. I sat down, trying to remember how I sit in a chair at a table, especially a card table at which nobody else is sitting. "Relax," said someone with a note of command. I slumped back in the chair and placed on the table the papers I was going to use and began fussing with them. "Shh," somebody hissed. "Don't rustle them. This is a very highly sensitized mic, which picks up every slightest sound. It would sound like a waterfall if you rustled them." I began to drum my fingers on the tabletop, but a courteous official put his hand on mine and stopped that. tapping would sound like cavalry crossing a bridge to your listeners, he explained. Just take it easy. I leaned back in my chair and adjusted my tie, doubtless giving the effect of someone trying to take a leather belt away from a bulldog. In a moment, an announcer came in and said we were all ready to go. Okay, I said, standing up, let's get out. He smiled with calm assurance and said no, he meant that we were about to start the program. Everybody but him tiptoed out of the room. I sat down at the table again. I could see them all watching me from the control room. Somebody in there raised his hand sharply and let it drop sharply. I expected to hear the faint hiss of lethal gas escaping into the chamber, but instead the announcer started to talk. I creaked nervously in the chair at this, and the listeners heard, along with his calm announcement, the sound of a buckboard falling over a cliff. Finally, he pointed a finger at me. I sat bolt up and began to talk to the ashtray. When it was all over, everybody tiptoed whisperingly into the room and congratulated me on being only 5 seconds too slow. Not bad for a beginner. The record is 1/500th of a second. I got up and started out of the room, but a man followed me and took me by the arm. Where are you going? He asked. Let's all go out and get a drink, I said. But you haven't got time, he said. All this has just been the rehearsal. I must have tightened up horribly at that, for he said soothingly, take it easy. You got plenty of time to relax in. He looked at his wristwatch. You got 4 minutes. How to Relax While Broadcasting by James Thurber. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel arranged, produced, and performed most of our music. Mr. Ray was on guitars, bass, and drums, and Mr. Chanel handled the orchestration and the keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including some of the Beethoven compositions, arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2, written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. ESPN. How could you misspell ESPN or mispronounce it? It's spelled very similarly to the way it sounds. ESPN. ESPN. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever, and our announcer today was my friend Nancy Faust. Everything else pretty much my fault, as usual. That's Countdown for this, the 173rd day until the 2024 presidential election, the 1,228th day since dictator J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the legal system, use the mental health system, use presidential immunity if the Supreme Court makes it up, use the not regularly given elector objection option to stop him from doing it again while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday. The throat may be on the mend. The sinus infection may be on the run. Hopefully I'll be at 75% by then. Whenever the next one is, till the next one, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and what about her emails?